A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corn. I think it's fair to say that the international community is at a strange moment, something of an impasse with regard to the future of the Gaza Strip after the war, after Israel's war on the territory following October the 7th. And the territory is in a pretty bad shape infrastructurally, to speak nothing of the loss of life during the war. But it's also not, I think the war is not even at a stable juncture personally, or that's my take. Israel remains at the so-called yellow line and beginning to feel increasingly as if that might become a new permanent border for the state of Israel, especially as we've seen that many what have become de facto borders, like the blue line, began in exactly the same way as an armistice line. In fact, the 1967 line in Jerusalem, the exact same could be said. Even down, I thought it was very uncanny that they were demarcating the yellow line by putting up these yellow cylinders, and maybe others who haven't spent as much time in the odd pursuit of border spotting as I have mightn't have spotted the extreme similarity to how the blue line with Lebanon is demarcated. Exactly the same thing, just a different color of barrel, but literally down to the shape of the barrel, the same idea. But the model, however, if we ever do get to a point where the conflict is not just at a kind of permanent end with the hostages released, but at an actual something more approaching a definitive resolution, you would have something, Gaza Strip being rebuilt, but without Hamas having any role in it. And the US has taken the lead in pulling together a consortium to make this happen, or to try to make this happen. It's called the Board of Peace. And as the name suggests, it's a very technocratically flavored system that proposes to rule Gaza by committee. Now, my first thought was, that sounds like a horrible idea. This is the Middle East, where we have tribes and feuds and political and religious alliances. And I feel like the effort we've seen in the past whereby the conflict is reduced to, well, if people were wealthier and saw a path to prosperity, they would be less violent, is very simplistic and has never actually been shown to work. We've seen that approach tried numerous times by the Trump administration. But this is the Board of Peace is a very strange concept. It's it's almost slightly Orwellian. It's a coalition of board that's going to try to govern this territory from a boardroom, or so it feels. When I was looking at this today and read about, well, what is a technocracy in the first place before we begin tearing into the idea, and I mentioned that a technocracy involves the idea that the most qualified people are responsible for different functions, and that's actually something I've always thought is a good idea. We see here in Israel where often the people who have portfolios in transport, to name but a few, have no background in that area or often understanding of the best practices in their field, and that just seems like a really dumb way to govern. So my question is, firstly, the model that Trump is proposing, how can that be contrasted with what we might call typical technocracies? And as a form of governance, because we talked about that in a previous episode, the long tail of systems of governance, things like quadratic voting, direct democracy, things beyond democracy as we know it that have been tried in various parts of the world. And is there any parallel to what President Trump is suggesting that's going to work? We also should talk about the more typical approach we've seen. There's something called DDR that the UN has used in these kind of contexts called disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. That's that acronym for the day. And DDR has been attempted in various contexts and had different levels of success. I'd love to learn a bit more about that in today's episode. So Herman and Corn, let's talk about what the Board of Peace intends to do, how it intends to yield a satisfactory end to this conflict, where it's been tried before, how we might categorize it as a form of governance, and what is DDR in today's episode of My Word Prompts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. It is February 26th, 2026, and we are diving into a heavy one today. This is a topic that has been looming over global headlines for years now, but it feels like we have reached a strange static inflection point. We are talking about the future of the Gaza Strip, and a specific proposal that has been gaining traction in diplomatic circles over the last few months.
Herman Poppleberry here. And yeah, Corn, this is one of those topics where the technical details of governance actually intersect with very real, very high-stakes human consequences. Today's prompt comes from Daniel, who is actually listening from Jerusalem. He is there with Hannah and little Ezra, and his perspective is shaped by the literal, physical reality of the borders he sees every day. He is asking about the international community's struggle to find a path forward for Gaza, specifically looking at the proposed Board of Peace model.
It is a timely prompt, Daniel. Thank you for sending it in. It is one thing to talk about these things in a boardroom in Washington or Brussels or Riyadh, but it is another thing entirely when you are living in the shadow of a conflict that feels like it might be hardening into a permanent status quo. Daniel mentioned the yellow line. Herman? For those who are not staring at the maps every day like we are, can you explain what that signifies in the current landscape of early 2026?
The yellow line is a fascinating and frankly chilling development. In military and diplomatic cartography, we have the green line, which is the 1967 boundary. We have the blue line, which is the UN-recognized withdrawal line between Israel and Lebanon. But the yellow line Daniel is referring to is the current perimeter of the Israeli military's buffer zones and security corridors inside Gaza. Specifically, it refers to the fortifications around the Netzarim corridor and the Philadelphia route. Daniel mentioned seeing those yellow cylinders, those heavy, sand-filled barriers, marking the edge of where the Israeli Defense Forces have established a semi-permanent presence.
And the concern Daniel raised is that these lines, which are often presented as temporary security measures during an active conflict, have a habit of becoming the new de facto borders. We saw it in Lebanon. The blue line was supposed to be a marker of withdrawal, but it became the front line of a decades-long standoff. If the yellow line becomes permanent, it fundamentally changes the geography of Gaza. It shrinks the livable space and creates these partitioned zones. It is a physical manifestation of a pause that might never end.
And that brings us to the core of Daniel's question. How do you govern a place that is caught in this geographic and political limbo? The proposal currently on the table, backed heavily by the United States and a coalition of regional partners, is the Board of Peace. It is described as a technocratic consortium designed to govern and rebuild Gaza without a presence from Hamas.
Right. And that word technocracy is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. We have talked about technocracies before, way back in episode 592 when we looked at the case for technocratic ministers. But this Board of Peace feels different, does it not? Daniel described it as ruling from a boardroom, which has a very specific, almost corporate connotation. Herman, how does this actually contrast with what we typically think of as a technocracy?
That is the perfect place to start. In a traditional technocracy, you are looking at a system where decision makers are selected based on their expertise in a given field. The term was coined in the early 20th century, gaining massive popularity in the 1930s during the Great Depression. The idea was that the price system had failed, and that engineers and scientists should run the economy based on energy units and thermodynamic laws rather than money and politics. In a modern context, think of a minister of finance who is actually a PhD economist, or a minister of health who is a career surgeon. The idea is that technical skill should override political ideology. We see this sometimes in countries facing extreme crises, like Italy under Mario Draghi or Greece during their debt cycles, where a technocratic government is brought in to stabilize the ship.
But those are usually internal appointments. It is the country's own experts taking the lead, even if they are unelected.
Right? And that is the first major point of contrast. The Board of Peace, as proposed, is an international technocracy. It is essentially an external governing body made up of qualified experts from a consortium of nations, likely including the United States, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and perhaps European representatives. They would manage the functions of a state, everything from waste management and electricity to education and healthcare. but without the local political mandate that a traditional government has.
So it is less like an expert-led government and more like a receivership, like when a city like Detroit or Flint goes bankrupt and a state-appointed emergency manager takes over.
That is a much better comparison, Corn. In the corporate world, you might call it a turnaround team or a restructuring board. They come in, they look at the books, they fix the broken processes, and they try to get the entity back to a functional state so it can eventually be handed back to the shareholders. But here's the thing most people do not realize about technocracies. They usually lack what political scientists call input legitimacy. That is the legitimacy that comes from people choosing their leaders. Technocracies rely entirely on output legitimacy, which is the idea that if the water is running, the lights are on, the trash is collected, and the economy is growing, people will accept the rule of the experts because their lives are tangibly better.
That feels like a massive gamble in a place like Gaza, especially in 2026 after years of trauma. If you're ruling from a boardroom, you're physically and culturally removed from the people you're governing. Daniel mentioned that the idea of experts being responsible for functions is good in theory, but the boardroom model feels simplistic. It ignores the deep-seated social and political fabric. It treats the population as a logistics problem to be solved, rather than a community with its own agency.
It really does. And this connects back to what we discussed in episode 5083 about hacking the future of governance. We looked at how typical political systems often fail because they cannot handle the complexity of modern life. But the Board of Peace is trying to solve complexity by stripping away the politics entirely. It is trying to turn a geopolitical crisis into an engineering project. If we look at other models Daniel mentioned, like quadratic voting or direct democracy, we see a completely different approach to that same complexity.
Let us talk about those. Could you even implement something like quadratic voting in a post-war environment where the institutional trust is basically zero? For those who missed episode 583, can you give us the for dummies version of quadratic voting?
Sure. Quadratic voting is a system designed by Glenn Well and popularized by people like Vitalik Buterin. In a normal one-person, one-vote system, you cannot express the intensity of your preference. You either want something or you do not. In quadratic voting, you get a budget of voice credits. You can spend these credits on different issues. If you care a little bit about a new park, you spend 1 credit for 1 vote. But if you care deeply about where the new hospital is built, you can spend more credits. However, the cost of the votes is the square of the number of votes. So, 1 vote costs 1 credit, 2 votes cost 4 credits, 3 votes cost 9 credits, and so on.
It makes it very expensive to be a single-issue fanatic.
It is designed to protect the interests of minorities who care deeply about a specific issue while still allowing for a clear majority direction. It is a beautiful mathematical solution to the tyranny of the majority problem. But, as you pointed out, Corn, it requires a high level of digital literacy, a secure, incorruptible voting infrastructure, likely on a blockchain or some other decentralized ledger, and most importantly, a consensus that the results will be honored.
And that is the tension here. The Board of Peace is a top-down, centralized, we know what is best for you model. Quadratic voting or direct democracy are bottom-up, decentralized. You tell us what you need models. The international community is leaning toward the boardroom model because they are terrified of the wrong. People winning an election. We all remember 2006 when Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections. The international community essentially said, wait, not like that. The Board of Peace is an attempt to skip the not like that part by not having elections at all, at least in the short term.
It is a form of managed governance. But then you have to ask, who is it being managed for? If the board is made up of international experts, their primary accountability is to their home governments or the organizations that appointed them, not the people of Gaza. That creates a massive accountability gap. If the board makes a decision that is technically sound but socially disastrous, like, say, implementing a specific curriculum in schools that clashes with local values, there is no mechanism for the local population to push back other than through protest or conflict.
Which brings us to the other part of Daniel's prompt, the comparison to the United Nations approach called DDR. That stands for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Herman, you have looked into the history of DDR in places like Sierra Leone and Colombia. How does that playbook compare to this Board of Peace idea?
DDR is the standard UN playbook for post-conflict zones. It has been used in dozens of countries over the last 30 years. It is a massive multi-stage undertaking. Disarmament is the first step, and it is the most visible. You are physically collecting weapons from former combatants. You are destroying stockpiles. You are trying to reduce the sheer volume of hardware in the streets. In Gaza, this would be an astronomical task given the tunnel networks and the decentralized nature of the armaments.
And then demobilization?
That is the process of breaking down the military structures. You have to take these people out of their units, process them through centers, and formally end their status as soldiers or militants. You are essentially dismantling the social identity of the fighter. But disarmament and demobilization are useless without the third pillar, reintegration. This is where most DDR programs fail. Reintegration is the long-term social and economic process where former combatants return to civilian life. It means finding them jobs, providing psychological support for PTSD, and making sure the community is willing to take them back.
If you do not have a robust reintegration plan, you just end up with thousands of unemployed, angry young men who still have the skills of a soldier, but no way to feed their families. They inevitably drift back into organized crime or new insurgencies. We saw this in Iraq after the disbanding of the Iraqi army in 2003. It was one of the biggest strategic blunders in modern history.
Now, compare that to the Board of Peace. The Board of Peace is more focused on the macro level, the infrastructure, the big picture economy, the boardroom decisions. DDR is a micro-level, human-centric process. The United Nations approach to DDR is usually tied to a political peace process. You have two sides who have agreed to stop fighting, and the DDR is the mechanism to make that peace stick. In Gaza, as of February 2026, you do not have that mutual agreement. You have one side that has been largely dismantled militarily but still exists as a social and political force, and another side that is occupying the territory behind that yellow line.
So the Board of Peace is essentially trying to do the reintegration part, the economic rebuilding, without the peace agreement part. It is like trying to build a house starting with the roof. If you do not have a political settlement that the people actually believe in, then any attempt at technocratic governance or economic reintegration is going to be seen as a form of pacification or even collaboration.
It is a very risky categorization of governance. If we were to categorize the Board of Peace, it is almost a return to the trusteeship model of the early 20th century. After World War I, the League of Nations created mandates where advanced nations would govern territories until they were deemed ready for self-rule. We know how that ended. It often led to decades of colonial-style administration and eventually very messy, often violent independence movements. The British Mandate for Palestine is the literal historical ancestor of the current conflict.
It is a bit ironic, is it not? We are looking at a 21st century technocratic solution that looks an awful lot like a 1920s mandate solution. Daniel mentioned the blue line with Lebanon. That is a perfect example of a temporary measure that has become a permanent feature of the landscape. The United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, has been there since 1978. Interim is right there in the name, but they have been there for nearly 50 years.
There is a saying in diplomacy that there is nothing more permanent than a temporary solution. The yellow line in Gaza could very easily become that. Daniel mentioned the yellow cylinders marking the line. It is a visual, physical manifestation of a pause that might never end. If the Board of Peace becomes the governing body, and it manages to keep the lights on but never transitions to a local government, it becomes a permanent technocratic occupation. It becomes a company town on a national scale.
So let us talk about the potential for a satisfactory resolution. What would that even look like under this model? Herman, you are the one who reads the white papers and follows the policy wonks. Is there a version of the Board of Peace that actually works?
If it works, it would have to be a bridge, not a destination. A satisfactory resolution would mean the board has a very clear, very public expiration date. It would need to have specific, measurable benchmarks. Not just, we will stay until things are stable, because stable is a subjective term that can be used to justify staying forever. It needs to be, we will stay until the GDP reaches X, or until we have trained 10,000 local civil servants, or until we have held a census and established a voter registry.
And those benchmarks have to be tied to a transfer of power.
The only way to gain local buy-in is to show that the boardroom rule is leading toward local rule. You could even integrate some of those advanced governance models Daniel mentioned. Imagine a board of peace that uses quadratic voting for local community projects. Instead of a board of experts in Washington or Abu Dhabi deciding where a new school goes, they give the voice credits to the people in a specific neighborhood in Gaza City. That would be a way to build input legitimacy, while the technocrats handle the output side. It would be like training wheels for democracy.
That is a fascinating idea. Using technocracy as a protective shell while you regrow the muscles of democracy. But that requires a level of humility and long-term thinking that we rarely see in international interventions. Usually, the people in the boardroom want to keep the power because they think they are the only ones who can do the job correctly. They get addicted to the efficiency of not having to deal with voters.
It is the expert's trap. You become so focused on the technical efficiency of the system that you forget the system is supposed to serve the people, not the other way around. We touched on this in episode 592. When a government is made up entirely of experts, they can become blind to the emotional and cultural needs of the population. They might see a protest against a new tax as an irrational response to a necessary fiscal policy, rather than a sign of a deeper lack of trust. In a place like Gaza, where the trauma is so deep and the history is so contested, irrational, emotions are the primary driver of politics. You cannot solve that with a spreadsheet or a 5-year plan.
No, you really cannot. And this is where the DDR comparison gets interesting again. One of the key components of successful reintegration is social capital. It is the trust between individuals and the trust in institutions. If the Board of Peace is seen as a foreign imposition, it destroys social capital. People will stop cooperating with each other and start looking for ways to subvert the system. They will see the technocrats as just another occupying force, even if they are wearing suits instead of uniforms.
So we are looking at a potential impasse. The international community wants stability and security, which points toward a technocratic board. The local population wants agency and dignity, which points toward self-governance. And the security situation on the ground, that yellow line points toward a long-term military presence. It is a three-way tug of war. And the Board of Peace is the rope. If it pulls too hard toward technocracy, it snaps the connection to the people. If it pulls too hard toward immediate democracy, it risks another Hamas-style takeover that the international community will not accept. And if it just sits there, it becomes a permanent part of an unstable status quo.
You know, Daniel's observation about the yellow cylinders really struck me. It is such a specific, mundane detail. A yellow barrel filled with sand. But it represents this massive shift in the reality of the land. It is like a scar that never quite heals. It just becomes part of the body. If the Board of Peace is the surgeon trying to fix the wound, they have to be careful not to create a body that is entirely made of scar tissue.
That is a powerful way to put it, Corn. And that is actually your first analogy for the episode. I am keeping track.
Oh, I know. I am trying to be careful. But it fits. When we look at how these systems are categorized, the Board of Peace is essentially a technocratic mandate. It is a hybrid. It is not quite a colony, not quite a state, and not quite a non-profit. It is a new form of corporate-style governance applied to a geopolitical crisis. It is sovereignty as a service.
Sovereignty as a service. I like that. It is a very 2026 way of looking at it. But we should look at the practical takeaways for our listeners. Because even if you are not a diplomat or a resident of Jerusalem like Daniel, this model of governance by consortium is something we are seeing more of globally. Look at how the international community handles things like climate change or global health crises. We are increasingly leaning on boards of experts to make decisions that used to be the province of elected politicians.
It is the depoliticization of the world. We are trying to turn every problem into a technical problem, so we do not have to deal with the messy reality of conflicting values. But values are where the real work happens. You can have the best logistics expert in the world, but they cannot tell you what a fair society looks like. They can tell you how to move 10,000 tons of grain, but they cannot tell you who deserves it more.
So the first takeaway is to be skeptical of any proposal that claims to be purely technical. Every technical decision has a political consequence. If a board decides to rebuild a port before it rebuilds a hospital, that is a value judgment, not just an engineering one. It reflects a priority of trade over immediate health outcomes.
The second takeaway is about accountability. In any system of governance, whether it is a board of peace or a local school board, you have to ask, who can fire these people? If the answer is no one in the local community, then you are not looking at a democracy, no matter how many experts are involved. You are looking at a management team. And management teams are accountable to their bosses, not their customers.
And the third takeaway is about the long-term effects of temporary measures. Whether it is a borderline or a governing council, we have to look at the incentives that keep those measures in place. Once a board is established, it develops its own bureaucracy, its own funding streams, and its own reason for existing. It becomes very hard to dismantle because the people inside the system have a vested interest in its continuation.
It is like that old joke about the most permanent thing in the world being a temporary government building, or in this case, a temporary yellow cylinder.
Precisely. And that is two analogies. You are at the limit, Korn.
I am done, I promise. But this discussion really highlights the complexity of what Daniel is seeing on the ground. When you are standing there looking at those yellow cylinders, you are looking at the physical manifestation of a global struggle to define what peace actually looks like. Is it just the absence of war? Or is it the presence of a functioning, self-determined society? The Board of Peace seems to be betting on the former. They are hoping that by providing the absence of war and the presence of infrastructure, they can eventually pave the way for the rest.
But as we saw in our episode on engineering sovereignty, episode 544, the literal nuts and bolts of a state are inextricably linked to the political soul of that state. You cannot build the pipes and the roads without also building the trust and the laws. If the Board of Peace ignores the soul of Gaza, the political aspirations and the historical trauma of its people, the pipes will eventually burst.
And that is the challenge for the international community. Can they be more than just a boardroom? Can they engage with the people of Gaza not as beneficiaries or logistics problems, but as partners? If they can do that, if they can use their technical expertise to empower rather than just manage, then maybe the Board of Peace has a chance. If they cannot, it will just be another entry in the long list of temporary interventions that define the 20th and 21st centuries.
It is a tall order, but it is the only one on the table right now that seems to have any momentum. Everything else is just a continuation of the fighting. So we have to hope that the technocrats are smarter and more empathetic than their reputation suggests. We have to hope they are looking at those yellow lines not as permanent borders, but as temporary markers that need to be erased.
We should also mention the sitrep method we talked about in episode 553. Daniel's prompt is essentially a high-protein intelligence briefing. He is cutting through the emotional commentary and looking at the structural reality. That is what we need more of. Instead of just reacting to the latest headline, we need to look at the yellow lines being drawn behind the scenes.
And for our listeners who want to dive deeper into these governance models, I really recommend going back to episode 583 on hacking the future of governance. It gives a lot of context for why these traditional systems are failing and what some of the more weird alternatives like quadratic voting actually look like in practice. It is not just science fiction, it is being tested in small-scale communities right now.
And episode 592 on technocratic ministers is a great companion piece for understanding the expert's trap we talked about today. It is a recurring theme on this show because it is a recurring theme in our world. We are constantly trying to outsource our difficult moral decisions to experts, so we do not have to feel the weight of them.
It really is. Well, Korn, I think we have covered a lot of ground here. From the yellow cylinders in Gaza to the boardrooms in Washington and the mathematical beauty of quadratic voting, it is all connected. It is all about how we choose to live together and who gets to make the rules.
It is. And it is a reminder that the weird prompts Daniel sends us are often the most important ones. They force us to look at the underlying mechanisms of our world. They force us to look at the yellow lines.
They do. And speaking of our world, if you are finding these discussions valuable, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or Spotify. It genuinely helps other curious minds find the show. We are trying to build a community of people who are not afraid to look at the hard problems.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. We love seeing this community grow. You can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today, at myweirdprompts.com. There is an RSS feed there for subscribers, and a contact form if you want to send us your own thoughts or your own yellow line observations.
You can also reach us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you listen to your favorite shows. We love hearing from you, even if, especially if, you disagree with our analysis.
And just a quick note, our theme music and all the music you hear on the show is generated with Suno. It is pretty amazing what that technology can do, and it fits our theme of looking at the intersection of technology and human creativity.
It really does. Well, this has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Korn. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to Daniel for the prompt. We will be thinking about you and Hannah and Ezra. We will see you next time.
Goodbye, everyone. Stay curious.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep